we can journey closer to the truth together. So I hope that's helpful for you all.
Sounds good to me. Let's have a chat. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you to my patrons and channel members. Today, we are looking at Trent Horn of the Council of Trent. His points aren't laughably inept like most people that I usually cover. Rather, they are well done and worth talking about seriously. He begins by making the claim that...
And today I want to talk about atheism, or a part of atheism that I think has a fundamental flaw.
He sets up the argument by discussing how many believers make poor arguments for God by committing the God of the gaps fallacy. First, he explains the fallacy.
So basically it goes like this. God of the gaps objection claims that arguments for the existence of God, they all fail because they all essentially say the same thing. Here's something we can't explain, or here is a gap in our knowledge. God explains the gap in our knowledge, therefore God exists. In other words, you can't argue in this way. I don't know what caused X, therefore God exists. That's a bad argument.
It's a good explanation. I wanted to disagree with a minor point. I didn't think that all arguments for God committed this fallacy. But as soon as I wrote that, I started looking for a philosophical argument that didn't commit a God of the gaps fallacy. I couldn't find one. This never occurred to me before, that maybe all of the arguments basically express incredulity over one thing or another being impossible without a God. I'm still not convinced that they all fall here. Surely there must be some philosophical argument for God that isn't based on God of the gaps fallacy. If you know of one, leave me a note in the comments. Otherwise, I'll concede this point to Trent.
Now, the unexplained thing, it might be morality or the beginning of the universe or the existence of something rather than nothing. Whatever it is, atheists say we don't want to rush to a supernatural explanation because we might miss an undiscovered or unknown natural explanation.
Once again, I congratulate Trent. This is a clear, concise steelman of the atheist position.
And actually, a lot of Christians feel the same way. The Lutheran pastor and Holocaust victim Dietrich Bonhoeffer once wrote this. He wrote, "How wrong it is to use God as a stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge. If in fact the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed further and further back, and that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with them and is therefore continually in retreat."
I would agree again. I think this is exactly why we are seeing believers having a hard time rephrasing the arguments, as versions of them are disproven. The classic example is eye evolution. Some apologists continue to be perplexed at how an eye can evolve without a God creating it. Yet this has been explained. How human eyes have evolved is now within our knowledge. Pegging a particular thing as impossible without God leaves the apologist retreating when a natural explanation is discovered.
On the one hand, I agree that arguments for God should start not from what we don't know, but from what we do know. They should start with effects we observe, and then reason to a cause for those effects, and then show that that cause must have divine attributes.
That sounds like a reasonable approach. Can we get to a God? Let's find out.
I worry that atheists who lean too much into the God of the gaps objection, they'll end up making atheism as unfalsifiable as some religions.
He's not wrong, but I don't think it's atheists that make atheism unfalsifiable. I think atheism is inherently unfalsifiable. It's why it's an unprovable position. I freely admit I cannot prove that there is no God. I don't think that there is a God, and I haven't been given a good reason to think that there is one, but I can't prove that there isn't one either.
Or they won't be able to answer this question: what would prove God exists? A few examples I've heard from atheists include healing an amputated limb through prayer, rearranging the stars to say God exists, or discovering on the human genetic code that our genetic code says made by Yahweh on it. Evan Vales says that if all the stars realign to spell the words Mene Mene Tekel Uparshin, which is what God wrote on the wall at Belshazzar's feast in the book of Daniel, then, quote, that would convince me of theism or polytheism. No other explanation is remotely plausible. Doug from the Pine Creek channel says that since the prophet Elijah could call down fire to light a soaked sacrifice in the book of Kings, and he could one-up the prophets of Baal by doing that, then Christians should be able to prove Christianity is true by just setting a wet napkin on fire through prayer. Now, some of the examples are better than others, but they all share the same flaw. I would ask the non-believers who offer these examples, why would these particular things convince you that God exists?
It's a good question. The atheist answer is that these cannot happen naturally, thus they are proof of the supernatural. But Trent finds a flaw in this response.
I suspect ultimately this is the reasoning. I don't know what caused a limb to be healed, or the stars to move, or the napkin to catch fire. I can't imagine a natural cause. Therefore, God must have done it.
He's right. It's the exact same reasoning.
In other words, they commit the God of the gaps fallacy in their hypothetical evidence. I don't know what caused X, therefore God exists.
Trent then gives the example of Dan Barker making this argument in a debate with him. Trent points out that such events that don't appear possible are not convincing, as evidenced by...
I mean, look what happened when actor Harrison Ford picked a card out of a deck from magician David Blaine. And Blaine then pulled that card out of an orange in Ford's kitchen. Did Harrison Ford say, "Oh my gosh, you're divine," or "Oh my gosh, God exists"? No, he said this.
Get the out of my house.
And Trent is right. When I see a magician perform, I have one of two thoughts. Either, I know how you did that trick, or, I don't know how you did that trick. But either way, I still recognize it as a trick. When I see reactions like these...
We're going to have you solve this Rubik's Cube without even thinking about it. 1, put it in front. Open your eyes.
I attribute the reaction of the judges to the fact that they are actors. They can fake amazement at just about anything. They can fake any emotion. They might truly be amazed at the trick, but I don't for a second buy that the judge really thinks that the performer has magical powers.
So I think this shows we have a double standard among some atheists, specifically among those who dismiss classical arguments for God as essentially saying, I don't know, therefore God. They dismiss all the classic proofs, I don't know, therefore God. But then they say you could prove God exists through one of their hypothetical examples, like guessing a card in an envelope, which is also a case of I don't know, therefore God.
He's right. We need to have better arguments.
The bottom line is that no matter what wildly fantastic scenario an atheist proposes that would allegedly prove God exists, you could always ask him, how do you know that there isn't an unknown natural explanation for that scenario?
An excellent question. This is exactly what we ask believers, so it's a fair case of turnabout.
So it seems like you can either have an extreme God of the gaps view towards the arguments for God and write them off, or be open to God existing, but you can't be both.
Here I would disagree. First, why did the God of the gaps fallacy suddenly become an extreme position? At the start, you acknowledged this as a poor argument. So why would holding firm to the position that this is a poor argument be an extreme position? Unfortunately, he doesn't explain this. Further, I most definitely believe that one can consistently reject all God of the Gap's arguments and be open to the idea that the existence of a God is possible. Just because I have not heard any convincing arguments for the existence of God does not mean that such an argument doesn't exist. Just as the lack of evidence of a God doesn't prove the non-existence of a God. The non-existence of a good argument for God doesn't prove the non-existence of God. Thus, I can reject all God of the Gap's arguments as they merely express incredulity at how something can be without a God, and yet still be open to the possibility that a supernatural being exists despite the lack of a good argument. In other words, just as I expect the theist to be open to changing what God or didn't do based on what we have empirical evidence for occurring naturally, so I am open to the future discovery of whatever might support or prove the existence of a supernatural being. I have no idea what that discovery would be. Where I think the atheists in your examples fell flat was in trying to come up with examples of what the evidence of God would look like. I think what we have to do is admit that if such evidence exists, we don't know what that evidence is. Once we admit that we don't know what the evidence could possibly be, then we can take the position that we are open to such unknown evidence, yet still reject any God of the Gap's argument. Next, he argues that atheists shouldn't ask for testable evidence of God that would mean God is part of nature and not supernatural. From that point, he concludes,
God's existence is something you would demonstrate philosophically, like other immaterial things you would demonstrate philosophically, such as the existence of minds, moral truths, or numbers and other abstract objects.
I disagree, as I don't think anything can be proven philosophically. One can have philosophical discussions about things like morals and discuss different positions, such as the realist and anti-realist. Arguments can be made for each position, and some arguments are more convincing for others, causing some to change their opinion. But none of these are proofs. They are just arguments and discussions. They are good for shaping thought and refining one's position, but they don't rise to the level of proof, nor do they try to, for the most part. Second, not all abstract ideas require philosophical arguments to support them, as they can be proven without such evidence. For example, democracy is an abstract idea, but examples of democratic governments exist that can be observed. Does that mean that we can observe democracy? Not really, as what constitutes a democracy varies in opinion among different people. But the existence of democratic countries proves the existence of the idea, even if the ideal isn't achieved. No philosophical proof is needed. Philosophers can debate the merits of democracy or what should or shouldn't be included in its tenets, but not its very existence. The same could be said of beauty. It also is an abstract idea that doesn't require philosophical proof for its existence, as I think everyone has a concept of what is and what isn't beautiful, even if they disagree on the particulars. Are you now thinking, Granny, don't all people, even atheists, agree that ideas of gods exist and thus don't need proof of their existence? Yes, I agree. There is no question that the idea of God exists. The question is, does a person of God exist, or a supernatural force that could be construed as a god? Most people, when they argue for the existence of a God, don't argue for the concept, but that God is real and is not merely an idea. I find it interesting that Trent is equating God to an abstract object, such as a number. Does he not think of God as a person? If God is a person, he needs to have the qualities of a person. God is supposed to be a unique person who has no physical properties or even demonstrable effects of these properties. Is this possible? I'm not saying it isn't possible. I'm sincerely asking the question. I think at this point you have to define what a person is. If this definition can include God, you can claim to believe in a God who is a person. But if your definition of person doesn't include an abstract God with no identifiable natural existence, then can you say you believe in a personal God?
An atheist might say, well, God is all knowing. So even if an atheist personally doesn't know what would convince him, God knows what would convince him. And therefore, God could just show that person the evidence he needs, and he won't be ignorant about God anymore.
Very good. I have made this argument many times, as it is a big part of what shattered my faith. The realization that a personal God that wants people to believe and has the power and ability to communicate what each person needs to know in order to believe, but chooses not to do that, is an incoherent thought. If God wants an outcome and can produce that outcome, but doesn't, can you really say that the God wants that outcome? The God might like that outcome, but has chosen another with a greater good. But if that is the case, then God doesn't want the outcome of everyone believing. He wants the outcome with what he sees as the greater good. No matter what you attribute to God, one of his essential attributes fails. He either doesn't want everyone to believe or is unable to achieve that result. If God is supposed to be making everyone, and he truly wants everyone to believe, he could easily limit himself to only making people who believe. There are so many ways that an all-powerful being could achieve this result that not achieving the result can only mean that it isn't the desired outcome, or that the God doesn't exist. The Calvinist owns this. He says that God doesn't want everyone to believe, but only wants the elect, the ones that he created as his chosen ones before creation. And while this theology is coherent on this point, it becomes incoherent when you try to align it with the claim that God is love. How can a loving being make a few people for his glory, but the masses were all created for the purpose of being tortured in hell for eternity for his glory? It also fails in that it claims that humans are predestined to hell, but man is condemned for his own individual actions. Add to that the Calvinist claim that original sin attaches before birth, and babies are sinners condemned to hell at birth unless God elects to save them. How can an infant that dies be said to have committed anything worthy of eternal hell? This is why I find all versions of Christian theology incoherent. I have yet to encounter one that doesn't claim one of these two positions, and both are incoherent.
I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a God. But if there is such a being as a God, then one would think that that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened.
I think one way to address these objections is to shift the question away from what evidence would convince you that God exists to what evidence would make it reasonable for someone to believe God exists. You see, being convinced of something, being convinced seems to be almost a matter of like personal taste. For example, I could ask Matt Dillahunty, how would you know that what convinced you that God exists actually gave you a good reason to believe God exists?
Does that matter? First, I don't agree that what is convincing is a matter of personal taste. It is a personal matter, as what convinces one person won't necessarily convince another. But it isn't a matter of taste. I can be convinced of things that I find distasteful. For example, climate change. I don't want it to happen. It is distasteful. But the evidence that it is happening is overwhelming. Yet some remain unconvinced, not because it pleases them to be unconvinced. They either simply don't see the evidence or they think the evidence to be flawed. Second, shifting the idea to what would convince someone as being the standard of God's responsibility to communicate what he wants, because that's really what we are talking about. If there is a God that wants people to believe him, what responsibility does that God have to communicate that desire? Isn't a reasonable shift. Does someone mean it needs only convince one person? If so, then by this standard, people need to believe in every religion, as someone is convinced by each one of them. If by someone you mean most people, now you are advocating for religion by majority. If most people believe it, you must too. One issue with this path is the Muslim faith is the fastest growing faith and is on track to overtake Christianity in about 30 years. Will you then convert as the evidence has convinced more people? It's an appeal to popularity and should not be the basis for determining truth. It doesn't give you a good reason to believe that God exists.
I mean, people are often convinced of false things. So the fact that something convinces Matt Dillahunty to believe, it doesn't mean it's a good reason.
I agree. And just because you have been convinced, or 1,000,000 people have been convinced, doesn't give me a good reason to believe that your God is real.
Saying that what would convince Matt Dillahunty to believe is just what would convince him is circular. It reduces the debate over God's existence to whether certain external observations merely cause us to have convincing internal feelings rather than following a process of reasoning. That's why I think it's better to ask whether certain beliefs are reasonable or unreasonable, and then use our reason to follow the arguments made in favor of those beliefs to see if either one of the premises is not true, or we have no good reason to think it's true, or there's been an error in the reasoning or a fallacy.
I agree with you on how to be convinced of something. Look at the premise, the support for the premise, and the conclusion for any error in reasoning. Let's use your own methodology here. Premise 1. People should be convinced by arguments that use sound logic. Premise 2. Matt Dillahunty is convinced there is no God based on his feelings. Conclusion. Matt Dillahunty doesn't have a good reason to not believe in God. There is a glaring problem with this argument. There is no evidence in support for premise 2. Premise 1 I have granted you. But if you want to make this argument, then you need to support your claim that it is feelings that are the basis for Matt Dillahunty not believing in God. Thus far, you have provided none. You played a clip where he says he isn't convinced, and then you have asserted that his not being convinced is based on feelings. Produce a clip of Matt saying that this is the basis of his conclusion in order to support your claim. Otherwise, your premise fails by your own words.
We have no good reason to think it's true.
You have provided no reason to think feelings are why Matt Dillahunty doesn't believe. So your second premise cannot be the basis of any conclusion.
After all, you can think something is reasonable even if it doesn't convince you. And that seems to take us more into the domain of reason than the domain of feelings.
Okay, yes, you can have an event. 5 reasonable possible causes of the event. Then you provide evidence of why you think the one you picked is the most reasonable. But you keep saying that we need to stay in the arena of reason and out of the arena of feelings, implying that Matt's rejection of God is based on feelings. Yet you have given us no reason to think that you are right on this point. How did you conclude that Matt is in the arena of feelings? Is this just a feeling that you have? If not, if you have a reason to believe that, then provide the reason. I'm skipping where he goes back and forth between 2 conversations where he shows Matt Dillahunty to be inconsistent on an irrelevant topic, ethical veganism. I don't see it as supporting anything that you are saying here, and it doesn't support your claim that Matt's lack of belief in gods is based on feelings and not reason. I'm also skipping his statements about there being reasonable people on both sides of the arguments. There are, but again, it's off topic and doesn't support his claim.
So let me return to the title of this video, which I admit it's a bit of a generalization, but video titles can kind of be that way. I said there's one question atheists can't answer, and that's what would prove God exists? I said it's not helpful to frame the question as what would convince you God exists, since that's more about feelings than rational discourse.
We now see why he thinks Matt's rejection of God is based on feelings, because it doesn't convince him personally, and what is needed to convince a person is based on feelings. No, it isn't. Look at it this way. Suppose a young Earth creationist asserts that the Australopithecus afarensis we call Lucy is a knuckle-walking ape. This is an assertion made by Answers in Genesis. Suppose they present their evidence to a group of 6 people, myself included. The other 5 are all conservative Christians raised to believe that the Bible is inerrant and there was a literal global flood as described in the Bible. The other 5 are convinced that Ken Ham is right when he says, regardless of the status of Lucy's knee joint, new evidence has come forth that Lucy has the morphology of a knuckle walker, which is a distinctly quadrupedal specialization characteristic of some living apes and is quite different than walking upright. Richmond and Strait identify 4 skeletal features of the distal radius of the living knuckle-walking apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas. They also identify similar morphological features on 2 early hominids, including Lucy. They are convinced because this is the only evidence that they are given, and based on this alone, this is a reasonable conclusion. I, however, also listen to Erica Gutsick-Gibbon, who is a primatologist. I have heard her explain why the pelvis, not the knee, is the basis for understanding that Lucy was bipedal and not a knuckle-walking ape, as claimed by Answers in Genesis. Thus, I am not convinced. My not being convinced isn't based on my feelings. It's based on my having more information than what was presented by AIG. If you only look at the information presented by AIG, their conclusion seems reasonable. But that doesn't make it right. The cherry-picked data that AIG offers, excluding the evidence from the pelvis, is what leads you to the wrong conclusion. So to characterize one person in a group being unconvinced by a presentation as being unreasonable and making a decision based on feelings without more evidence to support that conclusion is both unfounded and erroneous. It is entirely possible for one to be right and the group to be wrong. It has happened countless times in history with other people, not myself. Instead of ascribing feelings as the reason the unconvinced person was unconvinced, you need to ask why they were unconvinced. It could be feelings, or it could be other information that they know of, or it could be that they saw a flaw in the argument that no one else saw. A person can believe based on the information they are given. However, I also think it is more rational to not believe. I think that most believers, particularly the more conservative, don't really have a good reason to believe what they believe. They believe it because they were always taught it. I base this on numerous conversations with believers where few are able to articulate a good reason why they believe. It could be that I just haven't met enough believers that have a more rational basis for their beliefs. It could be that I haven't looked in the right places. But from my experience, the majority cannot give me a rational reason for what they believe. In the end, it comes down to a personal feeling, with many of them outright just saying that their personal feelings are the only reason that they believe.
I'd rather ask an atheist, can a person rationally believe in God? And if so, under what circumstances could that take place?
I think you have answered your own question in the question. A person can have a rational belief in God if they have a rational reason for that belief. I think what you meant to ask is what reasons for belief have you heard that you found to be rational? But if you phrase it this way, now it's back to a personal opinion as to whether or not I find the reason rational, and you would characterize that as a feeling as it applies to me personally. But even wording the question as carefully as you have, you still are asking me for my opinion. Do I, as an atheist, think a person could rationally believe in God? No matter what answer I give, this is my personal take on the matter, which you have already characterized as being feelings and not a rational conclusion. So why ask the question? If instead of asking each atheist personally for an opinion, you want a group conclusion that applies to all atheists, so it isn't a matter of personal opinion, it isn't going to happen. Atheists are not a well-defined group with a rigid way of thinking that applies to all, any more than believers are all of one mind. There is no rational reason that all believers hold as to why they are believers. so it would be unreasonable to expect such a thing from atheists. The whole point here falls into the fallacy of poisoning the well. Trent spent 15 minutes of a 20-minute video setting up that a personal belief is a mere feeling that can be dismissed as being irrational. Then at the end, he asked the atheist for his, her, or their personal take on the matter. Since you have predetermined that any answer to your question is going to be based on an irrational feeling, it isn't possible to rationally answer your question. If you want a rational answer to your question, you must first be open to the possibility yourself that what has convinced me personally of my position can be rational.
It's not helpful to say, well, under this miracle, this specific miracle, or that specific miracle, it'd be reasonable to believe, because those are just examples of sufficient evidence, subjective examples. They aren't objective definitions of what level of evidence would be sufficient for anyone to believe, even if that level of evidence is not convincing to everyone.
Why do you demand this of the atheist? Do you make the same demand of a believer? I don't doubt that you think your reasons for belief would be sufficient for anyone to believe, but clearly it is not, as many don't believe it. You have a good point that atheists shouldn't ask for a personal magic trick as proof of the existence of God. But how about what I asked for in a recent video? A book, written by God himself, clearly explaining who he is and what he wants, and a copy of this book for every person on the planet, or the book written on a substance that doesn't even exist on Earth, so it's clear it didn't come from here. This isn't something personal for me. It's something that I would expect to be tested by people in many different fields, all to authenticate that this book really can't have come from our planet. The writing isn't from a human. The linguistics aren't of human origin. The information contained is beyond what humans have or are capable of discovering. Such a book and a copy for everyone isn't a personal miracle. It's something that, if existed, should provide a rational basis for everyone to believe. But as far as objective definitions go, yes, I cannot believe in a God that is incoherent. To believe a God, you would need to demonstrate that these attributes of this God don't preclude the God's existence. I would need to see a definition of what God is that doesn't contradict itself. This is why I think it is possible to have a rational belief in a God. I do think such a definition is possible. A deist might be able to do this, mostly because a deistic God doesn't come with the baggage of wanting to communicate something to humans or having any control over or plans for humans. Once you start going here, you need to prove far more than just the existence of your God. You need to prove that your God is able to communicate. You also need to prove that communication from your God really is from your God, and so on. But as to believers I have encountered, I have yet to find one that doesn't hold to beliefs about God that are self-contradictory. Most of my experience is with Christianity. The Christian God is self-contradictory. All the omni characteristics don't mesh with reality of our world.
For example, in a Q&A session after my debate with Ben Watkins on the existence of God, Ben said that he'd be open to believing God exists if he personally had an authentic religious experience. And he and the Real Atheology team admit that there can be rational believers who come to believe God exists either through religious experience or the force of logical arguments. Of course, another person's interior religious experience, it's not going to be very convincing to someone who can't directly see that experience. So in those cases, what might be more helpful are philosophical arguments for the existence of God.
I disagree. While you are right that personal experience wouldn't be convincing to anyone except the person who has the experience, I don't think there are any philosophical arguments for the existence of gods that are convincing. Greater minds than ours have been debating this for centuries, and we just keep getting the same tired arguments over and over, rehashed and reframed, but all arguing the same thing, which boils down to God of the gaps. And as our knowledge of the universe grows, these gaps shrink, and we see the flaw of the cosmological as there not being a beginning to our universe, and the fine-tuning as we realize the universe was not fine-tuned for human life, as the vast majority of it is hostile to human life, and so on. So unless philosophers come up with something new, I don't see philosophy as a logical route to God belief. Further, if there was a God that cared about people believing, and such a philosophical argument existed, don't you think this God would have said so by now, instead of letting billions of people go to hell in ignorance?
Now, another objection might be that if these philosophical arguments work, kalam, fine-tuning, different moral arguments, contingency, whatever, if they work, well, why doesn't everyone believe God exists?
Yep, exactly.
The problem with this objection is that philosophical questions can't be answered with something like an experiment that's easily replicated. Even some scientific questions can't be answered this way. So you're never going to get 100% consensus on these philosophical questions. We see this in the recent Phil Papers survey, surveyed hundreds of philosophers, and it shows that a lot of them are evenly divided on some issues.
Thank you. You just proved my point. The existing arguments aren't convincing to those who don't already believe. They aren't testable, but you are right. I wouldn't expect them to be. What I do expect, though, is if you make the claim that God does things that affect this world, like answering prayer, then that should be testable. If you are going to claim that God can be seen and felt in this world, then produce evidence of how God can be seen or felt. If this isn't your God has no effect on this world at all, then how do you know your God is anything but your imagination? You can't have it both ways. If you want to say there is no physical evidence of God in the physical world, fine, but then you can't also claim that God made the world, or God does anything in the world to answer prayer, or anything else that has repercussions in the world. Once you make that claim, then it should be possible to see evidence of those effects that God has on the world.
But that doesn't mean that the fact that they don't reach a consensus, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a position on these important philosophical questions if we've done our homework and research.
I'll grant you that. You're entitled to your opinion.
So here's my new question then for an atheist, and one you could ask an atheist or an agnostic or non-believing friend. It'd be this. What is the best argument for the existence of God? And what's wrong with it? Or what is the least problematic argument for God? And what's specifically wrong with it? Remember, to show something is wrong with an argument, you need to point out either an untrue premise in the argument or some kind of fallacy in the reasoning, specific fallacy, not just like it's got the gaps. What specific logical fallacy is being committed? And in that spirit, I hope both atheists and theists will critically examine the reasons that are given for the existence of God. So look at the arguments on either side, see where they work, and try to point out specifically where you think they don't work.
First, I find the question problematic. The question assumes that God belief is the default position. It assumes that one must believe in God unless one has a good reason not to. It's not phrased that way, but it's basically what he's saying. You need a reason not to believe. Do you make such a demand of believers? Or if someone says they believe, do you simply accept that they believe? Or do you tell them that they can't believe unless they can give you a good reason why they believe? If you do, it's a fair question, but I seriously doubt that you do this. So I have to wonder why you think your position deserves superior posturing as to be considered the default position. But in answer to your question, I think the fine-tuning argument is the best you have. Oversimplified, it says, if conditions in the universe were slightly different, life on our planet could not have existed. The fine-tuning of the initial state of the universe is due either to physical necessity, chance, or design. It is not due to physical necessity or chance, therefore it is due to design. I don't believe the argument for several reasons. First, the initial premise requires support. What appears to be fine-tuning may not be fine-tuning at all. Most of the universe, even most of our own planet, is incompatible with life. Thus, the first premise fails. There may be other possibilities for the appearance of fine-tuning, other than necessity or chance or design. Just because these three are presented doesn't mean these are the limitations. This is a second failure of the first premise. Next, how can one assert that the universe is not as it is by necessity or chance? We have no way of knowing this, thus it can't be taken as fact. Since premise 1 and premise 2 have now both failed, premise 3 cannot follow. This is an oversimplification, as I find the whole exercise pointless. Tell me which of my arguments is best and why you don't believe it. Okay, I did. You have demonstrated nothing, and I have demonstrated why I don't believe one of your arguments. So what? What did this accomplish? This has nothing to do with why I don't believe in gods, so why does my being able to do this matter to you?
Both believers and non-believers should do this. That way we can journey closer to the truth together. So I hope that's helpful for you all.
So the point was to get closer to the truth. I don't think we did. We rehashed some old point-counterpoint. I really don't think you can get to truth by rehashing old arguments. I think you see my not believing in God to be irrational. I'm guessing that you feel that if I would just look at your argument, I wouldn't be able to find a rational reason to reject it. But I can, and I did. I think a better question would be, why do you think God belief is necessary? Does it have to be a particular God? If so, why that God? Here's where I think we get to the heart of the problem. If there is a personal God that cares about what we believe about her, then she should tell us in a way that we can all understand. There isn't even close to universal belief in any particular God. So if there is a God, either this God can't communicate this to us in a way that we can all understand, or this God doesn't want to. You can't make the claim that this God did, as the message clearly wasn't universally received. So if there is a God that can't communicate with us, or doesn't want to communicate with us, why should we care? The universe with such a God and the universe without such a God look the same, as you demonstrated yourself by saying that there is no way to test any effect that God has on human life. You say that you care about truth and that if such a God exists, you want to believe in true things. Okay, but if it's impossible to tell if that's a true position or a false position, and it can't affect human life, what would it matter? Correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think you've taken this to a position of, if God exists, God is irrelevant to this world. The only thing left to do is live your life.